As with most of the sustainability dialogues, we'll be posting it on the Sustainable Claremont website, sustainableclaremont.org. There's information on the table here about Sustainable Claremont, including a little folder that gives you the opportunity to sign up and become a member. You can also go on to the website and find a lot of good things. Thanks to Jen Pizzolo, our outreach coordinator, for bringing this material down here. Jen, where are you? I'm not sure if Jen's going to want to say anything this evening, but we usually start about 5 after because almost inevitably there'll be a few people coming in a moment late. But I think we're close enough, so I think I'll turn over the program to Chris Fears. And thank you very much, Chris, for doing this.
Thank you, Freeman. All right, let me know if it dies off during the presentation here. Thank you, Freeman. It's great to be here. I feel like I'm coming back home. I used to come to every one of these dialogues. I think you said we're like in the 60s now.
89.
89. Okay, wow. Well, I've been to most, although I'd say in the last year it's trailed off. I've had to move on to some other responsibilities and haven't had as much time on Monday nights. But it's great to be here, and I'm here to talk to you about a very important project that the city has going right now. So the purpose tonight is to provide information on that project. It's called the Village South Specific Plan, and to summarize the recently adopted planning goals and principles, to provide information on future steps, and to answer your questions, which I assume are going to be oriented towards the sustainability component of the plan. But it's wide open. You guys can ask me about anything tonight. For those of you who've been to lots of other meetings on this, commissioners in particular, you're not going to hear a lot of new information. This is sort of a background for the group here. That's specifically what Dick Haskell was asking me to try to cover, to bring more people along so that as we move through this process of planning for this area, that everybody feels like they've had a lot of input and that they're up to speed on what we're trying to do. So with that, let me go ahead and just describe a little bit about what the area is. This is the area that's included in the specific plan area. It's circled in red here. It's 17 acres, and it straddles Indian Hill Boulevard. It's just below the railroad right-of-way, which right now has Metrolink and will eventually have the Gold Line. Just north of the project area, we've got the packing house and the parking structure, and this is the commercial building that has Blaze Pizza in it. The historic village is on the other side of Indian Hill. So just to highlight a few of the important components within the project area and just next to it, I'll start with this large vacant parcel here. It's now occupied by a 4-story student housing building. It's not complete yet, but it's capped out at the 4 stories, and you can go and take a look at that building. Within the project area, the northernmost end of the project area is occupied by the company called Vortox, which is owned by the Garner family. We've got Ted Garner here tonight. There's some components of that building that are really interesting, and some think it's going to come out as being historic when we do our environmental study. But that's a relatively small part of the footprint of the entire property. You can see about half the property is vacant. A lot of it's occupied by basically unfixed metal storage buildings. There's a couple of bowstring truss buildings, and then you've got the historic Spanish colonial facade on the front. So this property is now owned by the Keck Graduate Institute. Just below that is a narrow property owned by King Glass, previously Garner Glass Company. It's a business that remains there, at least in the short term, although I think that they're open to some redevelopment of the site and potentially moving that business to another industrial site outside of the city. Beyond that, we've got 5 acres, 5.5 acres. That's the Hibbard Chevrolet dealership, which is mostly just parking lot. So there we've got a few buildings. We've got the showroom here and some metal auto maintenance. There's a small home here that was used as part of offices for the dealership. And it's really one of those buildings that, sites that you look at in town and go, that's an opportunity site that really is big in terms of the city. We don't have a lot of just completely vacant sites, especially vacant like this and so close to the village. We then have a acre-and-a-half property here that's owned by the city of Claremont. And we bought that up in part because it's just sort of an extra piece of land. We had actually one small house on it when it was purchased about 15 years ago. The house was vacant. It had been heavily dilapidated, and eventually we, just because we were having problems with vagrants in the structure, we tore the structure down. So it's vacant land that's being held by the city with the idea that at some point, this bottom third of that block here was going to, we would be looking at that to try to figure out what to do so that we could utilize that land a little more efficiently. Right now you basically have some very small, mostly residential scale structures scattered around the perimeter and nothing in the middle. It just really doesn't lend itself very well to any kind of development. So I do want to talk about a little bit about the project area and how well located it is. Again, this is basically the project area here. Actually, I do want to back up. There are properties in the project area I didn't talk about. We've got on the corner of Arrow Highway and Indian Hill a large vacant parcel that could be commercial. And then we've got a series of duplexes and some office buildings here. There isn't quite as much opportunity here. You see we've got this small vacant parcel on the lower end, but it's not a very deep parcel, so what you can do with it is a little less than what we can do on the larger parcels. So now just to talk a little bit about the location and how great it is from being transit-oriented and centrally located in and near the village. I'll start by showing you, this is again, the historic village and the village expansion, which is located just to the north, and Pepper Tree Square Shopping Center, Pomona College, Keck Graduate Institute, the CUC Consortium. This is a large parking lot that will become a parking structure for the upcoming Metrolink station, which will be relocated from its current location next to our depot over to about there on the map. And then we'll be locating the Gold Line station where essentially just east of the depot. All that is with, the new future Gold Line is within a 5-minute walk of the project area. And with the new, when you relocate the Metrolink station, it'll be within a 10-minute walk of the Metrolink station. So all of that is considered a great place for development that can be less oriented towards single occupant vehicles and more oriented towards providing options for people who want to live with fewer cars or no car at all. And you'd be able to do that in this area. Again, just to talk briefly about how we would like to connect this site. Right now, it's really one very large block. It's about 550 feet wide across, and then 850 feet tall from north to south. And there's just no circulation in and around the area. So as you know, that's about 5 blocks that you would have in the village. So you don't have very good circulation in and out throughout this site, which really constrains it. And what we'd like to do is, again, take the 2 new transit stations into account and try to build connections through and around, to and from the site to the other sites around the project area. So I'll just touch really briefly on the current land use, designations and zoning. Basically everything here is zoned for auto-oriented uses. So we're looking at mostly industrial, which is the blue, it's called Industrial Business Park, And then this is highway commercial, and we've got office professional on the southern edge. And this is the zoning. Again, we've got business industrial district on the northern third of the project, commercial highway, and commercial professional. So this is what the existing buildings look like in and around the site. This is the Vortox building I was talking about, the Hibbard dealership, some of the houses that you find that have been converted throughout, and a gas station on the corner as well. This is one of the smaller office buildings. It's actually located on the east side of Indian Hill Boulevard. This is looking at the streets now. This is what you see in the area. And our sense, and the sense we've been hearing from the community and our designers, is that this looks and feels nothing like the rest of Claremont. And we really want to try to do something about that, try to take these streets and make them much greener and feel like they're part of Claremont, especially Indian Hill as you move to the south, where we've got the jacaranda trees in the median, and to the north, where as you go up Indian Hill through the village, the street trees are young there, but you can see they're going to develop and be much like we have in the rest of the village. And as you move north of the village, again, great, we've got that amazing canopy of the elms. And again, there's a lot of vacant land throughout the site area. This is what we're looking at going, we've got obviously very high demand in and around the village for the sorts of mixes of uses that we see there. It's our vibrant, sort of the heart of the community. It is the one regional draw that we have in the community in terms of commercial uses. We've got people that drive 20 miles just to come have dinner and see a movie in Claremont. We want to continue to build on that. And it's a great place to work as well, so having more jobs. And obviously, it's got the highest per square foot home values in the city. So all of that stuff wants to be located here. And this is what we've got, a lot of vacant land. So we see that as a big opportunity. So I'll tell you briefly, this is what we're imagining for the specific plan as its purpose. To reimagine this 17 acres of underutilized property, to work with the community to develop a new community vision for the area, to capitalize on the area's location within walking distance of the village, Gold Line, Metrolink, and the colleges, to bring new amenities and housing to the city and link the village to areas south of Arrow Highway. I think that's an important point to make. Right now, residents that live south of Arrow Highway, they come to the village as much as anyone else. But if you look at someone on 10th Street or 8th Street and how often they walk to the village as opposed to someone who lives south, it's a lot less because it's not a pleasant place to walk. You're walking through this long stretch of pretty dry, uninviting, vacant properties. And as you saw, the street trees are really nothing like what we have in other parts of the city. We also want to look at and consider preservation and reuse of historic structures within the plan area. So part of the analysis that we'll do as we move through the plan process is do an environmental review, which will include a survey by a historic preservation expert that will walk through and determine which homes are, I shouldn't say homes, which structures and trees and anything else in the site area that should be looked at as something that might need to be preserved. A little bit of background, the money, a large part of the money that's going to fund this project was funded by a grant from the LA County Metro. It's $418,000, and it's in their transit-oriented development grant program. And they're looking at, throughout the county, this is a map that kind of shows where they've awarded money. They're looking at areas where we can develop the sorts of uses, mix of uses and densities that support transit, and so that when they put a new rail station in, that people will actually use it. Just to touch briefly on what a specific plan is, it's a document created by an agency like the city. It creates new general plan goals and policies for the area. It creates new zoning codes to regulate things like building size, setbacks, height, and what uses are permitted. It lays out infrastructure standards for roads, sidewalks, bike paths, stormwater, catchment, and others. It lays out design guidelines for the plan area. And in the case of if we find historic structures, historic preservation guidelines. So a good example of a specific plan, I think we've got a great one that's right next door. It's called the Village Expansion Specific Plan Area. So it has all of those elements in it. And if you remember, the packing house was something that was slated to be preserved, as well as the building that the back abbey is in. These were two structures that, as we looked in the area, that were determined as something that needed to be preserved, and the document actually laid out how they could be, what constituted preservation and what sort of uses we wanted to see in those. Along with all this, creating the plan is completion of all the necessary environmental documentation. In this case, we expect that we're going to need to do a full environmental impact report under the California Environmental Quality Act. It's a pretty long process. It includes lots of studies of the area and analysis of some alternatives. If you've got questions about that, I'm happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. I just want to show you, this is sort of some examples of the types of detail that you get in a specific plan. So you can see this is a map that lays out various zones. This is just an example. We don't have this document yet. I do want to point that out. Right now, all we have is a set of goals and principles that were recently approved by the city council. And there was some debate. It actually took quite a while and several meetings in order to get some agreement on these basic principles. But now what we're doing is we've taken those general deal points, really, and we've got our consultant team laying out development standards and design guidelines. So this is just what some of those look like and the amount of detail you can expect in this document. Site design, building massing, all sorts of things, what buildings on corners should look like. These are some of what we're talking about when we start trying to talk about development that is oriented towards pedestrians and feels human scaled. So you can see we'll actually have guidelines about what that should look like. Again, more just design guidelines, and we've got things like sign regulations. So all of these sorts of things will be developed over the next few months in draft form, and we'll bring those back forward for another wide variety of public meetings and discussions so that we can hammer out all the details and how these little tools in the toolbox are actually going to work to achieve the vision that the community desires. This is Complete Streets. We've been talking a lot with our designer about how we make these streets more Claremont-like. And so we've actually been thinking through some of this already. These are some slides that the designer put together that I thought were really useful. So this is the current zoning for highway commercial. This is what the buildings that we have currently. But as you know, the zoning generally allows a certain amount of development that could be more intense than this. Obviously, it's not there to zone for vacant land. And this is what they think if we were to continue to have highway commercial, this is the sorts of developments that you would likely see on this site. This is the light industrial that exists. And if we were to keep the zoning and encourage investment in the area, you may see light industrial that looks a little more like this. A little more of the vacant buildings could be occupied by buildings that look like this. I will say that both of these options are mostly car-oriented, and they're really not. I wouldn't say that either of these qualify as feeling like they are part of the village. So we have looked at a number of mixed-use TODs and have sort of landed on this one in South Pasadena, aside from the village expansion specific plan, which we think is a really good model for this site. But this is slightly more up to date, and it has the Gold Line station as well. But you've got commercial buildings on the corner here closest to the TOD, and that's here, and right next to the rail station. And as you move up, there's two different housing types that are actually fairly dense, but appear and feel much like less dense housing types. So these, you can see they're built around courtyards, and when you see them from the street, this again is the commercial, and this is what those they're actually condominiums. they look like. So again, this is what the housing. So this is something that our designer is really impressed with and thinks is a really good fit in Claremont. So I'm just showing that to you so you can start to imagine what some of the possibilities are. So again, with that, we've talked quite a bit about this Vortex building and how that could be reused. We have a land use economist who got really excited because behind this building there's a bowstring truss open area that has a lot of light coming in, and they really saw that as having high potential for the sort of use as a creative office space. Here's some examples of what that looks like. Again, we've had extensive discussion about the landscape, and that seems to be a big part of what's missing in this plan area, and we'll certainly have standards that talk about providing for heritage class trees on the corners and creating planter areas, even though it's new development, but planter areas that will be able to support the types of trees that we have in the existing village. I just want to summarize a little bit of what we've been through already, and I'm really happy to be here tonight because we're never done with outreach to the community. But when we started this process, we immediately had interviews with more than 50 community members, including citizen groups, property owners, neighbors, and businesses, of which groups like Claremont Heritage, Sustainable Claremont, the property owners that live within the area, KGI, all of them came in and met with our staff. We went through a series of questions. We just sort of listened as what they thought would be, what some of the opportunities and constraints were for the area and what their ideas were. With that, we also had an online survey. We've had 11 public meetings to date. We had a large visioning workshop last July, so about a year ago. And I want to say that the Architectural Commission and Planning Commission have reviewed, and the City Council then adopted this set of goals and principles. I brought about 35 copies of the goals and principles. If anybody wants to take one on the way out, it's about a 6-page document. It's a little wordy. It's sort of a camel. It's been crafted by lots of different people. But I think it'll give you a pretty good idea of what we're trying to accomplish here. And if you have any follow-up questions or comments on that, I'd love to hear them. So I'll give you my contact information at the end of tonight's discussion. So as we move forward, we're just in the beginning stages. We're going to create a draft plan. We're going to bring that forward for some sort of public review and approval. Once that's adopted as the draft, we will go out and do the full environmental impact report on that. So we've got lots of additional opportunities for your input. So this is just the beginning. So now I'm going to go through the, excuse me for not going through every detail, but I'm trying to summarize, try to keep this lively, and then if you want to follow up on any of these goals and principles, I'll do that. So just to go through the 6 main goals. The first one is to shape new development. So we want to create a plan that will provide a clear vision and user-friendly standards and guidelines for the location, type, amount, scale, and design of new development that focus on the design of human-scaled, walkable public spaces and build on the remarkable character of the village and village expansion. Goal 2 is to have a mix of uses. So we want to have a plan that facilitates a mix of land uses and development intensities for the plan area that support feasible market-based development that improves the city's fiscal health, facilitates a 7-day-per-week, 18-hour-per-day environment, leverages nearby transit facilities and provides housing for residents seeking an active transit-oriented lifestyle, provides a mix of office and retail amenities that enhance neighboring office and educational uses, and provides apartments and flat-style condominiums, which are largely absent at this point in the city. Goal 3, village expansion. Basically, we want to copy what we have already in the village expansion, so I won't belabor this one. But we really do want to extend the beautiful, engaging, pedestrian-friendly public spaces and public art found in the Claremont Village and Village Expansion area. Goal 4 is active mobility. So we want to provide a high-quality, comfortable, safe pedestrian and bicycling environment throughout the plan area, connecting the plan area, the KGI campus, and adjacent neighborhoods to the village and transit improvements. These improvements should include providing village-style pedestrian improvements, minimizing the appearance dominance of the automobile by storing vehicles in parking structures aligned with attractive buildings rather than surface parking lots, and creating a park once environment, which is already found throughout the village. So I think you may know that. The general idea is you park and you go to dinner and see a movie and do some shopping, or you park once and go to work and go out to lunch without having to move your car. So we want to continue to do that in the Village South. Goal 5 is all about high quality design. So we want to include development standards and design guidelines for high quality, eclectic architecture. So we want to see a mix. We don't want to have just one style. And landscaping reflective of the historic character and quality of the central Claremont. We're also here talking again about preserving historically significant structures. I think that's really important because preserving historically significant structures gives an area that may otherwise feel sort of sterile because it's all new and they're built generally around the same time, and gives it a lot more character. I think that can be said for the village expansion, just with the packing house. It's not the greatest architecture, but it really adds a ton of character to the area, along with the Back Abbey building. And we've tried to create architecture in that area that kind of has the same feel, but still is of the day, with some historic references. And this one's not necessarily for the public, but we want to create a document that is oriented towards getting the plan implemented. We want to actually see these, this TOD get built. And that's one thing Claremont had going for it when we did our grant application. There's a ton of these plans that have been funded and never built. And we had one in Claremont here that didn't get necessarily funded as a TOD, but essentially is a TOD. And we went out and built it, and I think that we've had Metro and lots of other cities coming to look at the village expansion and the village as well over the years, because we have done a good job. We have a good track record of actually getting these things built. Next is the guiding principles. I'll just touch on them briefly. It's a restatement of many of the things that are in the goals, furthering those with a little more detail. I highlighted sustainable design here. But again, we're talking about mix of uses, complete streets, which means all modes, not just streets for cars, but streets that provide pedestrian facilities, bike facilities, and transit connections. Human scale urban design, again, that's what we have in the village. That's what we do so well. We've got these very narrow frontages on buildings, lots of things to look at, and pedestrian amenities, benches, and landscaping. So we want to continue that. Walkable blocks. So blocks in the village now are something on the order of 300 by 330 feet. What we have down in the village south is 550 by 850. So it's not a very good comparison. We need to find ways to break down that block. Talking about village scale architecture, it's a mix of buildings that are relatively, again, small scale out at the street, but we do have a variety between 1 and 3 stories in the village now. Pedestrian-oriented building frontage is a bit repetitive, what I've already been talking about. Strong local landscape. What we mean there is we want to try to continue what Claremont has done right that so many other cities in Southern California haven't done, and that is plant and then maintain heritage class trees, very large trees. So spend the money to actually keep them around long enough that they can develop a large canopy, and spend the money maintaining them. So that they can live 80, 90, 100 years like we have in the village now. Shared parking. So what's great in the village, it functions very well. We're using resources like parking resources very well in the village. Why? Because we're operating 7 days a week, 18 hours a day. So what that means is this isn't just a business park where people are there from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. We've got people that stay around Monday through Friday into the evening because they're dining and they're going to see a movie. On the weekends, we're even busier because we've got people shopping and playing and going to movies and dining. So, and it's great. We do a very good job. The Village Marketing Group does a great job of having lots of events. So we are a big destination within the Inland Empire. Sustainable design. I hope we'll talk more about that. It's one that we've sort of put off because we're sort of dealing with the bigger building blocks now, but at some point we're going to have to write a series of goals and very specific requirements about what are the sustainability components of this project. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts about that tonight. Community health, really what this means is active transportation, getting people out of their cars and in the public and around so that they're not just driving from their house pod to the drive-through and back home. We're trying to get people out and about, and having outdoor spaces to recreate is important as well. And historic preservation. This is, again, a big principle in Claremont in general, but certainly in the village. The sort of historic feel that we have is part of our charm. So I'll just touch very briefly on the project schedule. The preliminary research and the design principles have been completed. We're now working on the draft of the specific plan, which I'm hoping to have a draft in September from the consultant and maybe bring it forward in October. That's pretty ambitious at this point. We took a long time to get the design principles approved, and it set us back a little bit. Environmental review comes after that. It'll start sometime in September, and we'll move through March of 2019. And then adoption of the final specific plan would be April, June of 2019. So it's about a year away. We got a lot to do in a year. So these are just some concepts. I really don't want to over-focus on them, but these are some of the drawings that we've been looking at with our consultant as we talked about breaking the site up a little. Actually, there's a better slide on this. We've talked about some of the uses and how maybe we would have commercial and retail closest to the village and a little more flexibility further south. We've talked about the height of buildings and retaining the lower building heights along Indian Hill and Arrow Highway. We've talked a little bit about what the open space framework will look like, and a big part of that, if you think about the village, is just the public streets and the little paseos that we have are such a big part of what the outdoor open space is in the village. This is the sort of spaces that we're looking at recreating, but we have a lot of really great ones already in the village and village expansion. And this is a better drawing of how we might break the block down. So what we would have, these are secondary connections. They would be most likely private streets and alleys. And this is something that we're looking at as a public street. So that's putting Green Street through and connecting to this street that goes through the KGI campus. The idea here is that it'll help. We'll have a traffic light at the intersection of Green and Indian Hill. It'll slow traffic. It'll create a great place to connect east-west, because right now you're hard-pressed to find, if you're on a bike and you want to get from KGI to the village, you've got a pretty tough connection through here running north-south, or even if you wanted to go from KGI to the other colleges. Now, if we're able to continue that through to Green Street, you could head over to College and up College, which is actually a pretty nice place to ride a bike. Again, just some concepts of what we've been looking at is coming in, putting in parkways, perhaps some bulb out areas, especially at that Green Street intersection. We may not put that at every intersection, but we were talking about it in this development in a way similar to what we did on 2nd Street in the village expansion. So if you notice, that's actually, in my opinion, is very successful at what it was supposed to do, is provide a really comfortable place to be a pedestrian and cross that street. Now, I'm surprised how many people actually cross that 1st Street, but it's just a testament to how successful the whole area is as a pedestrian district. But we're looking to do similar sorts of improvements in the plan area here. Again, this is what we're looking at and coming back in with more landscaping, larger trees. I don't want to over-focus on any of these. This is Arrow Highway, and the idea of trying to get more tree canopy so that it feels a bit more like the rest of Claremont. And this is that Green Street connection right now. Afterwards with the bulbed out intersection, street trees. These are small. We're going to be planting trees that will help shade this intersection. So with that, I'll go ahead and take questions. And I've got my contact information here as well.
And if you would, please raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you. As you can see, we're making a videotape recording of this. It will be posted on Sustainable Claremont's website. And in order to hear your comments, we have to have a microphone that feeds into the camera here.
Thank you. Chris, I think you anticipated the questions on sustainable design correctly. And I happen to have a question from Drew Reedy, who couldn't be here tonight, but if he weren't here, I'd be asking, or if he were here, I'd be asking the same question. There's a little background, 2-sentence background to this question. He's pointing out in the city's general plan, there is a significant and commendable commitment to sustainability in general, and municipal and commercial green building in particular. Given the need to create a climate-resilient city, many in the community continue to see this as a very worthwhile goal. So question, is the city committed to General Plan Measure 4.1, if you know what that is, which encourages LEED certification and green building standards that exceed State Title 24, so energy standards, and Energy Star conservation standards in future public and private development and major renovation projects. Now, nowhere in the presentation did I actually see, and you mentioned that it's not a done deal yet, but it is interesting, I think, as a design goal and a goal for the plan to actually have some specific general energy requirements on buildings and water usage and so forth. So he says, if so, how does the city plan encourage LEED or sites certification for Village South developments?
Yeah, I didn't see that necessarily. I think that's in our sustainable city plan, the goal about green building certification. But I'll say this, the sustainable city plan has requirements about, an expectation is that all new development would be built to LEED standards. So not necessarily requiring all private development to go and get LEED certification. With that said, since we passed the sustainable city plan, a astoundingly high percentage of all new large-scale development has been actually built and certified under LEED. So I want to say mostly because it's been built by organizations like the colleges and other long-term property owners. They tend to be a little more focused on getting things like certification. But with that said, the California Green Building Code has tightened up to a point where almost every building that's getting built today is qualifying in California, is getting built for to LEED standards. So I think a good example is the affordable housing project, Courier Place, that was built just south of the railroad tracks in a similar location, just over on College. It was, it's got solar and a few other innovative concepts, but just the location itself in town, near transit, allowed that building to get LEED Platinum. So they went out and got LEED Platinum pretty easily. And so I do want to point out that anything that gets built in this district is going to be very green in essence, because we hope that some of the standards that are created tend to lend itself towards development that will be transit oriented, so that we're minimizing the presence of cars and and facilitating walkable area around a transit station. So that's very green development. Does that answer that question, Mona?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. It's Freeman has the
This is the way I get my exercise.
Thank you. Would you speak for a couple of minutes on the interrelationship between the Village South specific plan and the general plan and the sustainability plan? Does one preempt the other? What is their working relationship of those?
In this case, as I said earlier in the presentation, a specific plan creates new general plan land use designations and policies for the plan area. So in essence, you're rewriting the general plan for this area. It will be fully consistent with the rest of Claremont's general plan, but it will, in essence, replace what's there now, which talks about basically retaining auto dealerships and industrial uses. And that's, we're moving on from that, and we're writing a plan to basically adopt new general plan standards for that.
Chris, I was just wondering, I attended the Planning Commission meeting, and they discussed it being a village somewhat like the expansion and actually the historical village. That's a great way of, I've never known how to say the historical village, you know. But this doesn't look like that. This looks like the retail commercial is just glommed on, you know, just put on one part, and that it isn't inside the village per se. Can you explain why? I mean, it's just the discussion that took place there, which I was really supportive of, was a mixed use throughout the, as much as possible throughout the development.
Yeah, sorry if some of these drawings are pretty old. We don't have new drawings based on the latest set of guidelines.
So that was the intention then.
Yeah, I mean, the blue
Okay,
areas,
cool.
the red
Thank
areas,
you.
all of those are mixed. I don't
Gotcha.
think we quite decided exactly where we would decide that we're not going to force retail. We were concerned that if you came in and said the entire first floor area of the entire area had to be retail, that it wouldn't be something that would get implemented. So we're still trying to find the right balance on that, and we haven't come up with anything new.
Cool.
So
Thank you for.
yeah, I didn't. So focus on the plan, the goals, and
Gotcha.
principles,
Thank
and
you,
not
Chris.
necessarily
Thank you.
some of those pictures.
I appreciate
was showing
that.
you.
The other question is, in terms of the trees, that would be fabulous in terms of the entrance to the city. Is it in the intention to go all the way down to the freeway so that it's extended past, just, you know, not just to Arrow Highway, but beyond? I noticed the part about Arrow Highway, but beyond Arrow Highway on Indian Hill?
Our belief is that the area south of Arrow is what we're trying to model it on, at least in terms of the tree canopy. I know that if anybody read last Friday's paper, that we're very concerned about those trees at the moment.
Yeah.
But absolutely, the goal is, right now we've got a row of mature jacarandas in the median and on either side that do a pretty good job of saying, you're in Claremont now. We're trying to duplicate that in this one segment that is frankly the least green section of the street throughout all of it.
Yeah, it really is. Thank you.
Chris, I was wondering, you seem to be projecting more traffic, vehicular traffic on Green between Indian Hill and College by the school. Have you addressed that additional traffic?
No, we haven't done a traffic study for projected trips, so we've gone out and measured actual traffic today. And once we know a little more about what we're actually putting in this area. So I'll say this. I think the main reason for having that traffic light there is so that people from this development can get out onto Indian Hill going north-south. And it relieves a little bit of traffic. We have a very congested intersection. I shouldn't say congested, but the left-hand turns coming out of Bucknell Avenue on Arrow Highway are it's a tough place right now to try to turn left, especially in rush hour. So this would relieve that. I don't anticipate a lot of through traffic necessarily.
So you're
going
not
through the
projecting another signal at College?
No, I mean,
Okay.
we'll know when we do the EIR and we do a full traffic analysis, projecting what we'll get. And there's all sorts of engineering models that will project that. And we'll look at that and see if it's going to be something that would reach warrants. That's not our goal. Our goal isn't to drive a lot of vehicular traffic. We want to create a place for people to get out and go north or south on Indian Hill, and for bikes and pedestrians to be able to get away from Indian Hill if they're going to the colleges and take College Avenue.
I just remember that twice a day it gets pretty busy there in front of the school, on school days.
Yes, yeah, and we'll certainly be looking at that. That's a good point.
Hi, Chris. Could you elaborate a bit on the residential units? There's the mix of sizes, the target populations, how many are rentals, will there be condos, et cetera?
We don't have numbers right now, but I can tell you we've had a very big discussion about that. And this actually, for me, goes back to when we were looking at a project called the Village Lofts. It's the vacant piece of property right across from the packing house. We had a long discussion at that time about, they were bringing in apartments, but they're luxury apartments, they're in the village, they were expected to have very high rents. And we realized as we were looking at that there really aren't any new rental apartments in Claremont. So if you want to rent something and you've got a fair amount of money to spend on housing in Claremont, but you don't want to own a house, you don't really have a place to go. You need to go rent somebody's house. You can rent somebody's townhome or condo, but there isn't a place you can move in quickly and move out like an apartment complex. So I don't think apartments are a bad thing. So and yes, I would like to see smaller apartments. I think when you're in and around the village, you don't necessarily need a ton of space because you can go right outside your door and there's all sorts of amenities and spaces to relax in, places to dine. So we're open to smaller footprint apartments. I'm not sure we've determined what that is, but we're going to look at talking about creating a diversity of floor areas, which we're not getting right now from builders. They tend to come in and they want to build something between 1,800 and 2,500 square feet, which is larger than what a lot of people want, that want to come and live in Claremont and in and around the village. So we're looking at that. I think a mix of for sale and for rent in this area is a good idea and something that would help bring a variety of people into the village area, customers, people that will shop, also people that are very likely to use transit. I think you'll see, and I've talked to people who are renting in the Village Walk apartments, which was part of the village expansion, who are young professionals working downtown and wanted to find a place where they could live without a car and take the train into downtown every day. So there's definitely demand out there. And their preference wouldn't be to rent somebody else's house. It would be to rent an apartment. So.
Yeah, I'm suddenly remembering our discussion with the Gold Line station, et cetera. There was a lot of passion, I think, about making sure that the Village South is well connected across the tracks to the Village West. You mentioned that, but are there any ideas for just how to do that? It's a pretty challenging goal, I think.
Yeah, we haven't let our consultant go to town on this one yet, but when we were looking at design teams to hire, they have actually a sub-consultant on the team that's an expert in sort of transit crossings and things like that. I remember them showing some slides during the interview process of South Pasadena right here and an intersection there where they had completely dummy-proofed this really awkward crossing that's surrounded by residential development so that they have things like railing and actually drop down. So if you imagine the gates that drop for cars, they have gates that drop for pedestrians as well. There's a lot, and especially with building Gold Line, you can, if you were to take that and get off at the various stations, you'll see there's lots of good ideas there, and we're going to be looking at all of them and trying to employ them. Make it easy to cross so you don't trip on the rail. There's ways to do that. And also to, again, make it kind of dummy-proof, so if you're not paying attention, you're not going to just happen to step out in front of a train, that there'll be something physically stopping you from doing that. Or if you have 2 or 3 kids and you're concerned about them getting away from you. So, yes, I don't know. I can tell you it's all there. Think of 2-bar rails painted yellow or powder-coated yellow. Again, it's sort of channelizing you towards a narrow spot to cross, and the gate drops as a train's coming through. So, as you know, we're doing a grade separation for Gold Line, so we're still talking about the existing trains. It's not every Gold Line train that's coming through.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for being available. Also, Sustainable Claremont for sponsoring this evening. With regard to housing,
Yes.
since I'm a realtor of 30 years and a resident of 40 years, there actually are already hundreds of rentals all around the village. They're not all brand new. Some of them are newer. Some of them have been rebuilt. But we do have already hundreds of rentals. We do really need housing that can be purchased by young professionals and/or others, so they can start, getting their nest egg going for the rest of their life. And I know I've mentioned at various meetings before, yes. Hopefully these buildings will be FHA and VA approved, so that way, not just the first-time buyers that purchase there now, but also resale later. And that was something that was missed in the Village Walk community, as later on, those buildings were not able to be sold FHA and VA, which then attracted more investors versus homeowners. In terms of square footage, we know a lot of builders like to do that 1,800 to 2,500 square foot model. We see a lot of that on Baseline Road, and nearly half, probably about a third of those are all rentals. And they're having issues of their own with so many rentals in that neighborhood that probably within this neighborhood, just like there's the community, it's Quail Creek, it's in Pomona, but there are some bachelor units, 500, 600 square feet. A young person could perhaps own something like that to be more affordable, and maybe whatever's on the top floor of the penthouses, they could be 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 square feet. And they would go for a premium. We could relay that to the developers, especially if they have a mountain view and or a city view. So I just thought I would throw that out there. And also hoping that there are some green spaces and or community spaces for whatever housing is there. And there could be a mixture of rentals as well as ownership. Hopefully it's more ownership focused. So green space, community area. So unlike many other communities that were approved along Baseline Road and other parts of Claremont where these little tot lots, it really is not enough when guests, owners, residents that live in these whatever units, whether they own or they rent, they have family coming into town, they want to be able to go somewhere. And yes, there is the village to go shopping, but not everybody needs to or wants to spend money. So hopefully there will be a community pool, some grass space, some green areas, so when folks do come to town, they don't have to go hang out at the Village Plaza. They can actually, have a barbecue at the community pool, that type of thing. And actually, one great example of that is Village Walk. That's actually a very nice, very well designed. There's a pool and a spa barbecue area. There's plenty of room for visitors. I have a client that lives in one of those townhomes. He's not well, but because it does have that community pool, he rolls to the pool area, and then his kids and grandkids come visit from other areas, and that's why he lives in that neighborhood. He has a stair climber to get up and down the stairs, but it is helpful to have that community area for the visitors that come into town. Thank you.
If you don't mind, the FHA and VA approval, is that because the percentage of renters, or what is it that disqualified them?
The buildings have to be approved on the front end. It's easier to get that financing in the future. And if they're not, it's just a few more forms. And FHA and VA, they just want to make sure the building standards are at a certain minimum. And since Claremont over time exceeds pretty much any and every minimum out there, it should be very easy to get that approval on the front end. And either myself or there are some local lenders that live in the area and work in the area, they could help the city fill out those few forms. So that way those buildings will be set in the future. Hopefully if any type of FHA or VA approvals expire, they can be easily renewed.
Yeah, interesting. I'll follow up on that. I guess I'm just surprised why the developers don't do that. I mean, if they're interested in.
They don't care. They only care about selling them as brand new, but later on as resales, the rest of us have to then deal with that.
Okay.
So if it's done on the front end, and I was involved in the Village Walk community with the Tolkien Company in the early 2000s, a few other realtors as well, and the builders nodded their head that they would follow up with that, but then it never happened. That never happened, and neither did the one-story housing, which is also desperately needed in this community. And if there is one-story housing, hopefully dual elevators in such buildings. That is very, very coveted. There are many folks, not just professionals, but there are many empty nesters out there. They don't wish to move into a retirement community and spend $6,000 to $10,000 a month. They still want to have ownership. And usually we've seen in many different studies, I'm sure you've done them, owners will usually spend more money and invest in themselves and the economy and the neighborhood and the community than a renter will.
Okay.
I'm a landlord myself, nothing against renters, but just it helps everybody that there's a little bit more diversity there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Hi, Ted.
Well, first of all, I agree with what what Jeff just said, but I have a couple of questions. To what extent, within the specific plan, to what extent does the city influence or control the development? And the second question is, how does this all relate to the public art requirement?
The first one's tough. The easy one is the public art. The public art right now, it's a citywide requirement. So new development over a certain threshold has to either construct on site public art that has a certain valuation or pay into a public art fund. So if we create a plan that gets new development in this area, you will see it accompanied with art. It's for commercial buildings, it's 1% of valuation. It goes towards art, and then residential, it's 0.5%.
Okay, but the more difficult question
Yes.
was within the specific plan,
Yeah.
to what extent does the city have control or influence? I guess there's a gray area there, but if you could just explain that a bit.
Well, I mean, we can write a plan that requires anything we want, right? But it doesn't, it won't necessarily get implemented. So at some point you have to recognize that there is some economic reality that we're facing here. But that's really what it comes down to is if we want, what's the vision? What do we end up with? And we put that forward and present it to, at some point the property owners are going to have an opinion about it and they'll weigh in at some point. Developers will have an opinion about it. But what we're trying to do is create something that extracts the right amount of public amenities and gets the sort of development that benefits our community that we want to see without going to a point where basically the plan will never get built and you'll just have people coming in to propose something entirely different after the fact.
I had the same question about what the city can and will require. And I understand what you're saying, but especially since this is a Sustainable Claremont meeting, I'd like you to speak more about what the city can and will require in terms of sustainability. A couple things. One is, I've always appreciated that the sustainability plan includes social sustainability. So what about affordable housing for disabled or seniors, things that can maintain and extend the diversity of our community? I came to Claremont 49 years ago to go to college. I only became a homeowner 17 years ago. I was a very active renter in the meantime. And I understand the other concerns, but there are people who don't want to own a house and would be very much part of the community and might have affordability needs that will exist throughout their decades of being here. And those needs should be addressed, even understanding that there's already rental housing. It's very expensive. So I wonder whether there's a way the city can include a requirement perhaps for a nonprofit development corporation to provide affordable housing that would remain affordable because it would never become market rate if it's built by a nonprofit development corporation. I'd like to understand whether, in terms of sustainability, the city could require something like an energy microgrid that could apply to the entire development area. And I'd like to understand about, in terms of commercial development, whether there will be any constraints on those businesses that would change the commercial culture of the city. So would we have anything to discourage large chains? Is there anything to encourage small businesses, local businesses, even local chains, so that you're looking at this, sustaining the culture of the city, both in terms of people and in terms of commercial development, and then enhancing what we can provide in terms of energy with something really innovative like a microgrid for the whole area. Thank you.
I'll start by saying, in terms of affordable housing, I was really pleased in the debate and discussions we've had so far that people were open to this idea of having some small units. Now, they're on a per square foot basis, they're not cheap housing, but it allows people to sort of right size what their needs are with their budget, so you're not stuck having to rent. Now, I understand there might be some small spaces to rent throughout the village, but a new apartment complex that has smaller footprints, or in the case of flats and lofts and things like that, where you can actually purchase a small space, that's something I think we're going to look at and we're going to try to encourage. We already have a requirement for inclusionary housing. So what that means is 15% of all new housing projects, 15% of the units have to be reserved for affordable people that qualify for either purchase or rental. For it's based on what the county average income is and paying a certain percentage of that. So I don't want to get into the details of all that, but all of that's in place now. But you're right, unless you have a nonprofit there that's going to maintain that that affordability indefinitely, it can go away after a while, if it's for sale and we're just following the inclusionary. Every time it goes away, the city then gets some money paid back into a housing fund so we can continue to do projects. But I think the big solution here is looking at having some smaller sized units that are more affordable, just because the fact is you're not renting renting or buying as many square feet. So, in terms of a microgrid, I'd have to look into that. That's maybe you and I should talk afterwards. You can tell me a little more about what that means to you, and we can I guess go talk with SCE about how that might be accomplished. Because I don't know offhand. It's tough to. Who are you looking at?
Peter
Oh. Okay, Peter. Oh yes, Peter. We'll talk.
Yeah, microgrid really just refers to each building being able to generate its own power, which is essentially net zero.
Okay.
And this can also be thought of as each building or a group of buildings having storage, generation, and interconnectivity. And given the size of the plot of land, there's no doubt that this could be a net zero project, meaning beyond lead, it is producing its own power for 24/7.
Okay.
That could be a standard, which would be nice to have.
All right, it's a very interesting point. I'll say, just from my perspective as the city bureaucrat that has to try to get a bunch of unrelated property owners and developers to do that, that one sounds like it could be tough. So I'd love to hear if there are other places that have been able to have a city-driven initiative that's accomplished that.
But didn't you just say that we could have whatever standards we wanted?
Yeah, so we can build this in.
Yeah, well, that's what we want.
If we load it up with too much. The one thing I want to say is there's going to be a ton of bells and whistles, things we can add. And that may be one, and another one
Yeah.
might be having some green spaces and a pool.
In all the beautiful pictures and projections that you put up there, there was not a single solar panel. That was a little disappointing to me.
All right.
I have a follow-up question on that. There has been talk of the city of Claremont adopting a goal of net zero energy. Do you think that that's reasonable to try to consider for the entire city?
Well, now you're way out of my wheelhouse. I'll say, Claremont has more wherewithal to do that sort of stuff than a lot of other communities. But with that said, we're mostly built out, and I think we have pretty good solar adoption. The NZE is coming for all new development, but when do you go back and retrofit an entire community? My discussions with some of the members here and people like Devin Hartman, the reality is the economics are there. We may find out that the entire community would go out and save money if they were to go do this, but it's a monumental effort. So I guess we'd have to define exactly what that is. We can go NZE on all new development. We'd be basically doing that a little bit before the state. The state's already working on that. It's really tough for a small jurisdiction to implement a requirement like that ahead of the state. You need a lot of staff to go out and enforce that and train every developer that comes to town or every homeowner that wants to remodel on how to implement that stuff. And it's much easier to wait and let the state code come in and kick in a couple of years later. So yeah, we've looked at that over the years, and it's been one of those things we've never felt like we, the city, had the amount of resources to go do that. And in fact, a small community like West Hollywood, if you go and look at what they had to spend to go and implement a greener building code than the state, I think if you talk to them, a lot of them would say, I wouldn't do that again, because we only bought ourselves a couple of years before the state came along and did almost everything we've done. So there's a good debate. I'm very open to it, but we have to look at the realities of staffing in a small agency like Claremont. Sorry to be a buzzkill on that.
Chris, I observed an architectural commission meeting in which the commissioners clearly did not like the design that was brought into them. They thought it was uninspired, it was dull, it didn't add to the beauty of the community, but they didn't reject it. They didn't feel that they had the right to substitute their judgment for the judgment of the property owner and the developer. How much right does the Architectural Commission have to say, this is not a pretty enough building for this place, we want something better? And do they know how much authority they have? And if they don't, what's being done to make sure that they know?
That's a very interesting question. Do I have to talk about it in front of a room full of people? I think they have more power than they always use, but you have to realize there's 7 commissioners, and some of them do believe that there's a certain amount of property rights, and they don't always want to be imposing their design style on basically a private property owner. I'd love to hear the project. Was it a college project, or was it a city? Well, I don't know what to tell you on that. I think they have a lot of power. They have to get together and really think these things through and have a good alternative in mind that they can say, we don't want to approve this. We're not quite there on that yet, but here's how you can fix it, so we will approve it. A lot of times there's a split between the commissioners, and you may just never see that they could decide what that alternative would be. So I think that's a little bit of a constraint on their power. So, Larry, do you want to speak?
In the debate over renters and homeowners, I think the mix might be okay. But, and living very close to it and having all the rentals, most of the rentals in town are in the south part of town. So I don't know how many more we can absorb, and there is a lot. One of the new buildings on Arrow Highway, I think it is, near Pepper Tree, is being redone. It's looking like it's going to be really nice. So I hope that will help. But, and I understand the affordability factor. But during SC, during the debates over SC, there was a lot of talk about young families, and this has been for centuries, but a lot of talk about young families not being able to buy into Claremont. And one of the things I thought about is when the Planning Commission talked about, different sizes, and they were sort of going along with 600 to 1,200. That it was a lot of the talk was about people who had retired and didn't want to move out of town, but didn't want to move into the retirement communities. I'm wondering if the 1,200 could also be focused on young families who maybe have one child and they want to move to Claremont, and they want to build, but they don't know how large their family is going to be. And they might have the opportunity by buying into say a 1,200, I don't even want to go by the numbers, unit or housing, place to live, home in Village South, build equity, and then be able to, once their family gets bigger, if that's the case, move into a larger dwelling. So that is a way, I think, that, and I'm not sure you do it by renting, I think you do it more by buying, where you're building equity in order to move into a larger place if your family grows. We see that in our neighborhood. We see that people do that. Some people stay because they never get bigger, but others, they get bigger, and it's happening in our cul-de-sac right now. And building equity is very important.
Hi. I'm wondering if there's some way that the city can incentivize exceptional development. Like how do these extraordinary things get created? Luck? Can't just be luck.
Yeah, do you have an example of exceptional development?
Well, like you showed the courtyard outside of Pasadena. You showed there's a lot of the examples you gave. Someone was talking to me about a place in Napa called Oxbow. There's all kinds of fabulous, like the examples where we think this is what we want. How did Santa Barbara do that? Is it just because it's Santa Barbara?
Which one?
That one.
Yeah, right here?
Yeah, it kind of looks...
That's very
sort
old.
of, kind of looks like Fort Knox.
Have you ever? Yeah. Santa Barbara has a very strong architectural commission, and they only let you build in one style.
Is there a way to incentivize this, like net zero places for, is there some way to get like SCAG behind this, or is there some place to use regions and leverage creative ideas? People are looking past the bottom line and more to doing great things at social justice and thinking of a bigger picture that's positive and good for everybody, including someone's bottom line.
I'll say this. Claremont has a community and staff and commissioners that do a decent job of trying to extract good things. I think in the village expansion, we did a pretty good job of that from each of those developers coming along. But we also, at the time, had redevelopment money, so we were able to use that money to help provide parking and a parking structure and help to construct that plaza. So that was a lot of city money and all of that. So when we had control, we could get really good improvements. And in the case of the village lofts, I mentioned this before at some of the other meetings, the initial development proposal was for something on the order of 95 units. We ended up building 179 So that was coming from the decision makers in Claremont Council and the commission saying, we want more density. And by providing that extra density, they were able to get, I'd say, the pool and the art that's in there, the park in the back. So you do start to trade off amenities for some density. That's been the big discussion that the Architectural Commission had, although I'm not hearing it as much from the Planning Commission, that if someone really wants that extra story on their building, let's give them a list of the things that they could do in order to get that. So maybe they do want to have a plaza like this outside their building because it's going to increase rents, but they can't make it pencil unless they had that extra floor. Again, I'll go back to the Village Lofts right across from the packing house. Again, the project didn't get built. It was for internal issues. It wasn't because it didn't pencil. But that developer came in and said, you know, we're going to come in and we want to build 3 stories of rental housing. And we understand you guys, the plan, the community, that you want it to be a retail district. And we can put a retail liner into an internal parking garage, but in order to do that, we have to have 4 stories. So we did change the specific plan to allow that property to have a 4th story in order to get better design that would have fit much better with the surrounding district as opposed to just something that was pure residential from the ground up with surface parking. So there's trade-offs, and we are talking as we draft this plan about creating that list of if you can check off 10 of these amenities in your project, you can do X, Y, or Z to increase density or the type of design that we allow you to do. We don't know exactly what that'll be yet, but those are the sorts of things we're looking at.
But thinking outside of Claremont regionally and even like nationally, remember that how with Devin Hartman, we tried to get that money to do, what was that again?
He wants to build a factory to make solar
Yeah,
panels.
but we tried to get that grant, what was from the Bloomberg, is that what it was?
Bloomberg, yeah.
Yeah, like aren't there any kind of like people who want to do really great things with all of their excess of money that they want to put into projects here in Claremont? Like foundations and things like is there some way to do that? Am I making that up? Is there any such thing?
I'm a member, I get all these bulletins from public spaces, and they talk a lot about these types of places and how to create them and give advice to cities. They're not talking about grants that are creating this. A lot of it's private funds, a lot of it's hardworking city bureaucrats trying to figure out creative ways to reuse a space that maybe just was vacant. Mini parks where parking spots used to be, things like that. So I'm not aware. It's a good question, and I hope that the rest of the room, if anybody can come up with any good sources of money that help pay for public amenities like this.
I think Devin Hartman's working hard on trying to raise private funds to build his factory, and I think he sees some state funding for potentially putting solar panels on many of the houses in Claremont.
Yes, but that has a financial return to the private investors.
Anybody else? Well, thank you, Chris. I think this has been a wonderful presentation.